last block. This block will run from the beginning in English, so that the discussion at the end of the presentation will be able to fully support combination of Slovak and Dutch speakers that we have here for today. As the first speaker in this panel, let me invite David Stancel to the stage. David is a Slovak guy working for years in the area, whatever is possible in years, with combination with blockchain and cryptocurrencies. There is a very special thing about David. I had a chance, David was part of my team some times ago, and he's a very nice demonstration that these days we are all at the starting line, regardless how old or senior are. We met 2 years ago, plus minus, first time. David was first graduate from Bachelor Studies those days, joining my former team, and already those 2 years ago, as a fresh graduate from Bachelor Study, he was a frequent and respected speaker on blockchain around the Central Europe. So regardless of how senior, young, experienced we are these days with new technologies, changing of the business, we have the same opportunity to capture what's around us and be experts in the new and fresh areas. So David, please tell us something about the introduction and basics around the blockchain.
Thank you, Pali. So good afternoon, everyone. So as Pali said, my talk will be in English, and today I would like to talk about blockchain, its emergence, its evolution, and most importantly also the narratives around it. Okay. So as you probably all know, like blockchain, it all started around 10 years ago when this paper was published. In 3 weeks, it will be actually exactly 10 years ago. And so the emergence of blockchain came as a solution for one particular problem that was first time addressed like in 1982, and it's called Byzantine generals problem, and it's related to distributed databases and communication and coordination of the nodes in these networks. So when anonymous author of this paper, Satoshi Nakamoto, published this paper, lots of people got excited because there were a lot of attempts for the last 20, 30 years how to address this problem, but they all failed in some way or another. And most of the time it was because of the kind of centralized nature of the solutions. So when this paper emerged, a lot of people got excited because he seemed to provide a way that is, for the first time, kind of like truly decentralized solution to the general Byzantine problems. What is the interesting fact is that if you really closely read the paper, you will not find the term blockchain, not even single time. So I don't want to talk much about Bitcoin, but I believe this is a very important topic when we talk about blockchain, and because it's very important to realize actually the roots and the whole the mechanics why blockchain was invented and what problem it was supposed to solve. So there were many attempts starting in the 90s with the companies like DigiCash that were trying to create some form of digital cash, and they all failed because of the centralization, because of many reasons. And to many people, to many scientists and engineers in that space, it was clear that the solution that is supposed to solve this riddle and to really create a digital cash, it needs to be truly resilient and decentralized, whatever it means. So that's why there is now increasingly more popular of the narrative that Bitcoin could become the missing piece of the puzzle of the protocols that the internet is built upon. Of course, there's a big question mark if it will be Bitcoin. There are lots of competitors on the market, and it can easily change. But it's increasingly more consensus that, and not only in this hardcore underground community, but rather also in the business community, that Bitcoin could play an important role in future economy. Okay, so if I had to choose one slide, like how to describe blockchain, what it is, I'm sure that you all have read and heard about all the amazing properties that blockchain has, but this slide, it probably sums it up pretty well. You know, you can see the pretty simple heuristic of the architecture of the systems. The one on your left hand, the centralized one, is one that we got used to a lot. And the one on the right hand, the decentralized systems and distributed networks, it's something that all the enthusiasts and engineers in the crypto space are trying to build. These distributed networks are very much different from the centralized networks in that regard that they don't have any central authority, they don't have any single point of failure, and all nodes in the network are equal. So there are like a super nodes with some privileges. Everyone is equal. Everyone is able and like to access the network and partake in the. It's good to think of blockchain as some kind of evolutionary step where we moved and the whole humankind has moved towards like a new direction, how we maintain and store the transaction, like data about transactions. So we moved from table, like stone tables through paper, classical ledgers, Excel sheets, now to the age of distributed ledger. Okay. And you have probably heard lots of applications and use cases where you can supposedly use blockchain and where it can be applied. And I will be maybe a little bit skeptical today about this point. And there are many areas where this is not actually clear, how you can actually meaningfully apply blockchain as a technology. And there's a lot of hype about it, but little has been proven. But there's a lot of consensus in the scientific community and the business community that this picture here kind of represents some kind of paradigm shift in the way like open source protocols are built. Because we know from the 90s when all the building stones of the internet were built, they were extremely useful and they were needed for all the applications to operate on top of them, but there were little incentives for companies to actually work on them because there was no like simple way how you can monetize that effort, because most of the economic value was captured on the application layer. And what we've seen with the blockchain in the past year is that due to its nature and some kind of tokenization of the new crypto digital assets, we can actually monetize development of the open source protocols. And it also, for the current data, it seems that the main change in the paradigm comes with that the most of the economic value is captured on the protocol level and not on the application layer. But we are, of course, still in the early days, and it's a question if this trend will reverse or not. So blockchain is often described as some kind of trust machine that does some magic and guarantees you that whatever is in the blockchain is true. Oftentimes, this is not really the case. What blockchain does is, and just in some cases, it can guarantee you that the data that you put in there were not modified or tampered with. And in many applications, like business applications, you have to also work with data that are not on-chain, but they are from the real world. So you kind of need to bridge those two worlds. And so you need to feed the data into the blockchain. And of course, the data in the blockchain are as good as the resources that you use to feed the data into your blockchain. So if your resources are corrupted, the data will be corrupted as well. This is kind of important thing, and the whole blockchain world has evolved in two sub-worlds, the public blockchains and the private blockchains. So public blockchains are those that are most notably used for applications of cryptocurrencies, open source protocols, and like Bitcoin, Ethereum, and others. They are pretty slow. They are, in some cases, very inefficient, but they are just good just for their very narrow use cases, narrow set of use cases. Whereas the private blockchains have been getting lots of traction in the last years, and they are much faster. They are, by design, they are closed in the sense that not everyone can actually access the network, can interact with the network, but all the nodes in the network are trusted, they are like verified, and they are like they're fit for the consortia purposes. They are, of course, this kind of network are much more faster. Oftentimes, they also use different data structures, they use different consensus mechanisms, and they are very similar to something what we called intranet in like a few decades ago. So, you've been reading, for sure, about many, many applications. So you can use blockchain here and there, and ranging from supply chain management, medical records, trade finance, and so on and so on. And it's certainly true that you could probably use blockchain in many applications, but what is really questionable is if it really makes sense. Because because in many of these cases, it doesn't really make sense to build decentralized solution. Because also with the private blockchains, you easily end up back with some sort of trusted third party that is designing the system, that is updating the system, and you as a participant in the network just blindly accept the outputs of the third party. So you still end up with sort of like a centralized or like a trusted third party that you rely on, maybe just in a different way. And the question is like, so if you are actually building such a system, if you cannot actually use technologies that we have been having here for a really long time and we have used them for a really long time, you can have open API, auditable, replicating SQL databases that are often even for free and open source, and you don't maybe really need blockchain for some use cases. And therefore, there are like these two main narratives in the whole blockchain world. And so the first one is that the blockchain is a very inefficient data structure that is suited totally for truly applications that needs to be, for some reason, decentralized, and they are often related to the money applications. The second narrative, which has been increasingly more popular in the last years, but I will argue that it's becoming less popular, for example, in the last months, is that blockchain is actually a universal tool for like a trust-reducing or trust-minimizing tool for various kinds of business applications. And so I would like to point out your attention to this article that I read just 2 weeks ago, which was published by a gentleman whose name is really hard to pronounce. I will not try to do it. But he was a blockchain lead in Ernst & Young in the US, and he spent like last 4 years building blockchain applications, mainly those that utilize private blockchains. And if you go on CoinDesk, you will still find this article. It was published really recently. And he writes very well in his piece, like the whole evolution of his and shift in his mindset and perception of the private blockchains in general. And he quit the EY recently, and as you can see in the title, he lost his faith in the private blockchains. And he's just one of the few. There were like lots of such examples, and not only in the business world, but also in this like hardcore cryptocurrency world, where there were instances of Bitcoin core developers that started with Bitcoin. They were very good in it. They were really good engineers and coders. They started to work for enterprises, build some private blockchain solutions, and after a few years, they quit and they ran away from it because it didn't make sense for them. And there are a few reasons for that. As I mentioned, lots of business applications that utilize blockchain and that you usually read about in the magazines and like this, analysis, they are rather blockchain inspired. They modify the data structures. They use new consensus mechanisms that are a little bit like not really much related to the blockchain consensus mechanism that is used in Bitcoin. And they often ended up relying on some sort of third party. And if you reach this point, it's really questionable whether blockchain actually makes much more sense and brings a lot of added value compared to traditional databases. And so this quote here is from the guy from the previous slide. And I believe this opinion has lots of merit. And he also advocates that probably where we will see in the future the most added value and the economic growth is in the realm of truly open sourced and open blockchain networks and not those private blockchain networks. Okay, when we talk about blockchain, we inevitably sometimes end up with a topic of ICOs and tokenization. I know it's a controversial topic, and it's definitely true. There has been lots of fraud, there has been lots of scams in that space. On the other hand, it has become an alternative way for businesses to fund, usually startups, to fund their activities. There were lots of attempts in the space to create new tokenization models and for businesses to issue new kinds of assets and new asset class. And what we've seen is that most of these businesses that went through ICO, they either ended up issuing something that we have known for a very long time in the legacy financial world. So they just issued new assets that are very similar to the old financial instruments, but just in the new dress. But what we have also seen, and I think this is an increasingly bigger topic in the financial world, is what we call STOs, security token offerings. So issuance of securities. So yes, the old legacy financial instruments on the new infrastructure. And even though STOs are a big trend, an upcoming trend for the next few years, ICOs are, and even though with ICO it's increasingly hard increasingly more difficult for any business to raise money through it, there is still the total amount of money raised through ICOs is still growing quite tremendously. So these are the latest data. So up until the end of September, the total money raised was around $20 billion. Okay, there are two sets of challenges that I see as critical when we talk about blockchain in general. So of course there are regulatory challenges. All regulators in probably all jurisdictions across the world are now trying to wrap their head around how to classify these digital assets, and they examine whether these assets actually represent some new asset class or if it's something old, and so on. There are new standards and efforts to create rules for taxation, accounting, and we've seen jurisdictions which are more progressive and are making lots of progress in this field, such as Malta, Liechtenstein, or Switzerland. Of course, as classification of these digital assets is one thing. Another thing is aforementioned ICOs and the STOs, because in this with STOs we need to kind of create a bridge between the on-chain and the off-chain world. That is something I mentioned before, and it seems it will be a big challenge for regulators all over the world. And of course, there are smart contracts. So when we talk about blockchain, we often talk also about smart contracts. What are they? they are considered to be just pieces of software, like self-executable pieces of software, contract, like if-then conditions, and that if they run on the truly distributed network, you cannot really stop them. Of course, if they operate with assets that are off in the real world, it's kind of easy to stop them. And to breach the whole realm of like the old regulations and laws and the new like world of applications that are using smart contracts will be probably one of the biggest challenge in the space. And of course, then we have already mentioned GDPR. It's very questionable how we will be able to enforce right to be forgotten on a truly decentralized and networks that are backed by massive resources of electricity. And inevitably, discussion about blockchain also often goes about the scalability. We know that blockchains are not really suitable for all kinds of data, rather than like transaction-based data or data pointers or hashes. But one thing is really clear, and that we need to be able to put more data into the blocks. We need to have more speed in terms of transaction per second with the blockchains, because the current numbers are pretty low compared to the legacy systems. Another thing is security. And when I talk about security here, what I mean is that all these open source protocols are just now being developed, and oftentimes the source codes contain lots of bugs, much more in general compared to like many systems and databases that are used in the corporate world. If I had this talk 2 weeks ago, I would probably say that the Bitcoin was considered to be one of the most secure network in the world, because it's been developed for 10 years now, and it's pretty simple in its functions. The script language it's being used there, it's very limited and it's very secure. But even in such a network like Bitcoin, just 2 weeks ago, there was a pretty severe vulnerability found that was not luckily exploited, but allowed for remote DDoS attacks on nodes. And if someone would exploit it back, like it could be really bad for the whole Bitcoin network. So, and this is of course much worse. It's much worse on a higher scale with other blockchains, which are considered to be Turing complete, like Ethereum and all others that are like being designed for truly decentralized applications and smart contracts. One of the other technological challenges is kind of eco-friendliness. The consensus mechanism that is being used in Bitcoin is oftentimes criticized because of how much electricity it consumes. It's this particular mechanism, it's called proof of work. And maybe the good news is that lots of other blockchains are increasingly more using different and alternative consensus mechanisms that don't actually consume that much energy. And probably the last thing, and when we talk about the whole blockchain space, is that the user experience is very miserable. All these applications are just at very early stage. They're just now being developed. Most of them have just prototypes, MVPs, beta nets, and it will probably take lots of time to get at a point where we can actually use them for some real world applications. So that's all from me. So my main point was here, my main message for you would be that I think it's really reasonable to challenge the narratives when we talk about blockchains, whether you hear that you can use it for all kinds of applications, or whether you hear about like ICOs, and because the narrative is changing a lot and very fast, and probably what I told you today will be already obsolete in a few months. Thank you.
David, thank you very much. Thank you for your introduction to the essential features of blockchain, its options, benefits, but also challenges. And now let me invite and introduce to the stage Dirk Hermans from the KBC Group. Very briefly, this is the head of KBC blockchain activities, and Dirk will tell us more about what blockchain can really do in the banking based on what is his experience from his position of leader of KBC blockchain. So, Dirk, welcome.
Thank you, Pavel. Good afternoon. I'm the last speaker. I hope you can still get it for one half hour. So actually, I'm from KBC, sister company of ČOZP Slovakia here in Slovakia. We're working on blockchain for 3 years now. And well, I don't know whether you were afraid of everything what David has told. But I want to try to give you an insight on what have we been doing with blockchain actually, effectively. We have some applications that we've done to give you insight. What have we done? What were our lessons learned? Also, how David finished. I have to say the same. This is my point of view of today, October 2018. I wouldn't have told what I will be telling 2 years ago, and probably within 2 years I will be telling something else. So it's a picture of today. Everything is evolving very hard, so that's also why we keep following it up. Okay, trust. It has been said a lot today. Trust is something that's very important, especially within the banking sector. And we always have trusted people. And if you see all these new technologies coming in, like AI, we have to start trusting technology. Today, we're still lucky that behind the technology, there's still some people, so where we can trust on. If your car breaks down, you probably can call the car assistance and someone will pick up and help you. The same if your mobile app is not working, you have a help desk to call to. And trust, especially in the financial sector, there's trust everywhere. We trust a bank to do transactions. We trust notaries to do transactions. We trust a revisor who look into our books. So it's every time there's people in between that deliver trust for our activities. David mentioned it, to have a security token on the blockchain, which is perfectly possible. This is the picture today of a security transaction. You're all out of banking, you know, central security depositories, custodians, all these intermediaries that today make a securities transaction happen. There are a lot of them. The client is not even on this picture. So there are a lot of intermediaries in the financial industry. And also we as banks, we are an intermediary, and blockchain claims that things can be done without an intermediary. Our CIO gave a presentation to Group Exco in 2015 on blockchain and what it could mean for the financial industry. The example was Bitcoin, that you can do a payment from a country to another country without using a bank. And what are we today doing as a bank? We are keeping data and we deliver the trust to the customer. And blockchain can replace that. So, everybody in this room, who would still have a job? Little people, I think. So there was quite some, it was a scary moment to see like, okay, we have to look into this. So that was the mission. We started up in 2016 to look into what is blockchain, what are the threats, what can we do with it, what's our position for the future. So we started investigating with 3 people, what is blockchain, what can it do, educating people, a lot of education, and to see can we do some projects to find out what blockchain is. So that's what we started in 2016, in order to not be replaced with a blockchain. One of the first conclusions of our investigation was, well, public blockchains, that's not something for us. Um, I won't say that I don't believe private blockchains anymore. I come back to that. But this is the reasoning why we don't use public blockchains. Because compliance said to us, what will you put on the blockchain? Yeah, we could put encrypted data on the blockchain. You cannot read it. Yeah, encryption is only valid for 20 to 25 years. People of security know better probably. But it can be hacked eventually if you put it on the blockchain, and it can be hacked in the future. Then you expose all the information. So we don't put encrypted data on the blockchain. We only put the hash on the blockchain. The second item, business people, they say, yeah, it's nice, transparency, everything is visible. But if I do an OTC transaction between KBC and ING, I don't want UBS looking at the transaction, what the pricing agreement was. So I want confidentiality. Confidentiality means we want to distribute the data, but only to those parties that are involved in the transaction. So not for everyone. Yeah? Public blockchains don't deliver that point. So that's why we chose for another setup. Also permissioned access. We don't want, if we are in a blockchain network with several banks, we don't want another bank joining it without us being able to control how the onboarding will be, etc. Just as we do also today, if we have correspondent banks, we also rate other banks and we see whether we go into a relationship, yes or no. The same goes for a blockchain network. We also make a private network, so it means that it's not accessible by everyone. Yeah? It's also not accessible directly by our customer, because we kicked off GDPR in May 2018, this year, the right to be forgotten. Yeah? Putting a client's data on a blockchain, he has no possibility to be forgotten. So we are still in between. We as a bank, we deliver a link between the customer and the blockchain, but if we remove the link, there's only a hash floating around on the blockchain that cannot be linked to the customer. Yeah? These were all reasons why we started with private blockchains. Yeah? I saw an article last week about an Austrian bank who issued a bond using public Ethereum, yeah? Public network. I'm very curious what they did, because today we don't do that. Is it an evolution? Don't know. Yeah. So this is why we worked with public blockchains, not with public blockchains and private blockchains. I'm gonna, to make it concrete, I have 3 examples of projects that we've done. We've done a lot of projects. We've done